Alright, ladies and gentlemen, so we have this blueprint, and let's pretend it doesn't have to be this vehicle. It could be a cabinet, it could be a shelf, it could be a thing you sit on, I don't know, whatever. So it could be a couple different, all kinds of different things. But what's going to happen is, as you move on with your 3D modeling adventure, you're most likely going to be 3D modeling things that are more complex, and we're going to be building things that are more complex. So if we look at this, this is overall decently simple, but if we look at all the dimensions on here, that's quite a few dimensions. So on this one blueprint, we have to do two things. From this blueprint, we have to get kind of two big things. We have to get information. We have to decipher what are the sizes and dimensions for each part. And then we also have to figure out, so for example, for the wedge, we can look at how tall it is right there. We can look at how deep the hole is drilled. So those types of things. And then another thing that we have to decipher is where do these parts mount on, where do the parts mount together? How do they mount together? What kind of distances do they have with each other? So for example, the straw. So this dimension right here is saying that this straw is centered. It's saying it's 0.5 inches. The center of this straw is 0.5 inches from this outside. So that tells me is if I'm assembling these parts, where to put them. Another example would be saying this 1 inch. This 1 inch is saying, hey, this straw is 1 inch back from the front. So that's information that helps me assemble. And then there's also information that helps me make the parts, like I identified. Like this helps me make the part to drill the hole. This helps me make the part for the height, that kind of stuff. So when it gets this cluttered, it gets to the point where the communication of what you're trying to design or what needs to be built, it just becomes there's too much on one page. We got to split it up. It's just too much information. So what we need to do, and it depends on what you're making, and you just got to ask me or your teacher, hey, you know, Mr. Group Road, what should I make 2 blueprints for my object? Yes or no, kind of thing. And I'll give you a suggestion on if you should or not. If it's complex, then it definitely should be. So if we look here, I have 2 blueprints. Here's just the assembly. Notice there's way, way, way less dimensions on this. So this is just the whole vehicle assembled, way less dimensions on here. And then now here's a blueprint that has all the parts separate. So what we call this blueprint the parts blueprint. We could do a blueprint of all the different parts. And depending on what you have, you may or may not fit all the parts on one page. You might have to do multiple pages. You could even possibly, depending on what you're doing, you could even do 1 part per page. Because these parts are small that I'm dealing with here, and I only have about 4 unique parts, then it's kind of like, well, I'm just going to put all these on one page and kind of conserve space and paper. So what I did is I placed each part on here. And now what this tells me is this tells me how to make this part. So what I would do is I can read this, and using this information I can make this wedge exactly how it says. So I know that the wedge is 6 inches long. I know that it is 1.5 inches tall. I know it's 1 inch wide. I know the very front of it is only a 1/4 inch tall. And then I also have the information of where to drill the holes. I could take this information in the shop right now and I could go make this. Whereas if I was looking at this one, that's a lot tougher. For me to make that wedge, that's kind of a pain. So that's where it comes in nice to do what we call the parts blueprint. That's just what we're going to call it, the parts blueprint. So there's our wedge. We could do the same thing. We could look at this wheel, and we have the information there. This is all information just about the wheel. Here's the straw, information about the length of the straw, the outer diameter of the straw, and then the thickness of the straw. Then here's our wood dowel. We got the length of the dowel and then the diameter of the dowel, another view of it. And one thing to take note here, we have 3 views of this wedge. So we can see the side, the top, and the back, or the front. That'd be the front. So that's going to help us in terms of visually being able to think about it and help us when we make it. For the wheel here, I didn't need to place it in the side view because, or the front view, because that's the same as the top view. I didn't need to do that. The same thing with these, because these are circles or cylinders. This amount of views are fine. So depending on what you're doing, you may or may not need to place in all 3 of those views of that object. So I got my dimensions in there. So I can easily recognize what all these are going to be making and what it's going to look like. I can place in a small isometric view, remember that's angled, isometric view of my full assembly, and bam, there it is. Okay, that kind of reminds me, hey, all this is going to go together and look like this. So now, what I can do is I can take this page into the shop, and then I can make each one of these parts. I can make each one of these parts very easily. It's communicated to me very clearly. And then I also have my parts list, so it's going to actually tell me, okay, vehicle bodies, I only need to make one of those. Thin wheels, I need to have 4 of those. Axles, I need to make 2 of those. So that kind of tells me what to do. And notice I call this parts, so I call it what it is. I call it the parts, so I know this is the parts blueprint. And again, you may or may not fit all your stuff on one page. You might have to use a couple pages. That's fine. So now that we have this information, there's some stuff that I don't know. I don't know. This blueprint right here doesn't tell me how far does this wheel stick out from the edge here, and it also doesn't tell me where the straw is located on the bottom. So what I have to do is now I create a second blueprint. So now this blueprint has less dimensions on it. So I got again my 3 views, the front, top, side, and then I got the isometric view. And then if you look here, there's those dimensions here. So I know the distance between the body of the vehicle and the wheel, and then I know the distance. This is going to the end of the axle. So now I know how far the axle sticks out of the body. So this is saying, hey, the axle sticks out 0.25 inches. So that tells me some assembly information. So now once I have my parts made and I'm assembling them, well, now I know, oh, that axle should stick out about 0.25 inches. Then if I look here, this tells me, okay, the straw, where do I put the straw? Well, the straw is centered, so it's 0.5 inches over from the outside. And then this says how far the straw should go back, because this is the straw here. Well, the straw, I should glue it on, or first I should measure and everything like that, but I glue it on 1 inch behind the front. So this is the assembly blueprint, and I got to change the name here. I should call this dragster assembly. And then again, so on this one, I'm only putting dimensions that I need to know for when I assemble this thing, like major things that I need to know. So once you have this assembly blueprint, then you should do some overall dimensions. Like for example, one thing that I would do is what's the dimension? I do it from the outside of this wheel to the outside of this wheel, drag it up. That would tell me the total width of the whole vehicle assembled. So then once I assemble the vehicle, I could actually check that, and I could say, okay, yeah, is this right? Is it wrong? Did I make it right? Those types of things. Another dimension I could do is the total height. I could do what's the distance from the top here to the bottom of the wheel and drag that over. And then again, that will tell me if I made it correctly. So those types of things. So you should, even though I only showed these couple dimensions, I should have a few more here for the overall total assembled, like the exterior dimensions of this thing. So to sum this lesson up, make some blueprints that have all your parts and all the dimensions for each of those individual parts, and then make a blueprint for when those parts are assembled together to tell like if somebody's going to read your blueprint, you need to tell them where do these things go. Like for example, again, the straw, how far back does it go? Is it centered? You know, those types of things. And then also the overall dimensions. Again, get your parts list in there with the balloons, those types of things. So make sure you do that, and then if you have questions, let me know.